Hi, welcome to our ninth discussion board. I was really impressed with all the posts that were on the eighth discussion board. Remember what we did yesterday is we talked about how would you feel when somebody that is a loved one passes away from COVID-19. Now, there were all kinds of responses. There were some folks that said I would feel guilty because I wouldn't feel like I had done enough. There were some folks that said I'd feel angry because I would be mad that something hadn't been done better to be able to keep people alive. There were some folks that said I'd feel frustrated because what if I wasn't able to participate in a funeral? Some people said they'd feel isolated because if you don't have this kind of public mourning and funeral process, how do you handle your feelings? Some of you were incredibly honest and said you didn't like my word choice. You said, Dan, why did you say when somebody dies as opposed to if somebody dies? And it's great. I love that. I love that pushback. I'm not trying to cause you a trigger event to feel bad. I am trying to introduce you to the way the world is so that you get an opportunity to develop your sense of what your feelings are going to be to that world. Part of being a teacher is to expose people to the way the world is and then helping coach them through that process. So for those of you that are saying, hey, why don't you use if rather than when? You don't if feelings, you when feelings. When something happens, you'll have a feeling. If you're going to if feelings, like if this would happen, what would be my feeling? You're not in the feeling part, you're actually in the head part, right? You're thinking of what your feelings would be. And thinking of what your feelings would be are not the same as feeling your feelings, right? So when somebody will pass away from COVID-19, you'll have some feelings, and it's good for us to share those in a when framework rather than an if framework. I know it might seem like, hey, but Dan, why are you picking these words or why are you talking about these sorts of things? Well, let's move from the feeling and let's move up to the cognitive. And in this ninth discussion board, let's get in the head of what's a good mental model to use to understand the world that we're living in. The phrase is called culture shock. I've seen it. I've lived through it. I know what it means. You've probably experienced it yourself. Culture shock is when the world is one way and you are now suddenly, fairly quickly, put into the world that's in a new way. And a lot of us have a response of rejecting the world. We say, nope, that's not the way the world is. I'm going to imagine that it is this old way. I'm going to focus on getting back to this old way and I'm not going to have anything to do with this new way. And that is a 100% reasonable response to culture shock. Others get super excited. They're like, well, I can't wait to experience my new world. I'm so excited. Think about those of you who might have been super excited to move into a dorm, to get away from home, to go to college. That is a way of dealing with culture shock. You're in college, you're not at home. That is different. That is a different culture. That is a different place. Your thoughts, your emotions, your actions are different at home and in college. Some of you are experiencing reverse culture shock. You've suddenly gone home in the middle of a semester and now you're like, how do I deal with reverse culture shock? Do I take on the habits and attitudes and behaviors that I did during like winter break or spring break or summertime? But wait, I'm in the middle of a semester and now I'm back at home. So how do I have some kind of sense of normalcy in this reverse culture shock? Some of you, when you came to college, were sad to leave home. You were like, I want to be back at home as much as possible. Anytime there was a weekend opportunity to hop in somebody's car, that's how you'd respond to the culture shock of coming to college. I've seen this a lot because for, 15, 20 years, I've worked a lot overseas as a cultural ambassador. It means I regularly hop on a plane, fly to another place, and deal with a different culture. It means that I have culture shock and I have reverse culture shock. So I've developed mechanisms, coping mechanisms for dealing with and recognizing culture shock. And a lot of those, they're in our head. So if you're not sure what culture shock is, it's you being moved from what you know to what you don't know, where it's not just that a little bit's different, it's that a lot is different. You're wondering, so what do you mean? For instance, in some countries, you shake hands, and in some countries, you don't shake hands when you meet new people. In some countries, you shake hands if it's a man and you're a man, and in some countries, if it's a woman and you're a man, you don't shake hands. In some countries, you greet each other with words and a hug, and in some countries, you don't. That's exactly what we're going through right now. We've gone from a world where we would give hugs and high fives and fist bumps and chest bumps to a world where we stand 6 feet apart from each other. If you don't think that's causing culture shock, you need to get in your head and you need to understand what's culture shock. You need to get your mind around the fact that we're living in a different culture. It's like we've been picked up and dropped in another country. And that feels weird. Now, culture shock is one of these things that we can get our minds around. We can say, okay, I can Google culture shock. I could Google reverse culture shock. I could look at how does the United States Department of State prepare ambassadors to go overseas. I could look at how Engineers Without Borders prepares students to go overseas. I could talk to people at my church that do short-term mission trips. I could talk with Doctors Without Borders. I could look at people who have gone from situations where it was in one culture to in another culture. That's the closest thing cognitively in our head to what we are all experiencing. This is culture shock. Going back home is a version of reverse culture shock. Being out on the street, seeing what's going on in the news, this is culture shock. So for those of you that are wondering cognitively, in your head, how do I get my mind around what I'm experiencing? The phrase is culture shock. That's what you're living through. Now, how do we in our head cope with being in a different culture? Now, sometimes there's a different language, and we certainly have a different language going on right now. We went from the language of understanding our classes to the language of suddenly looking at the news and trying to understand, well, what's a virus and what's a vaccine? What do we mean by social distancing? Should we do it for 1 week? Should we do it for 2 weeks? What do my symptoms look like? What does it mean to have a latency period? What does it mean to be asymptomatic? What do all these tests mean? What does it mean to have an RT-PCR test? What does it mean to have a CT test? Right? We suddenly have an entirely new language. That's culture shock. We have an entirely different schedule. We're waking up and eating at different times. We're studying in different ways. That's culture shock. We suddenly have all kinds of different people around us, which produces a different environment, both our emotional and physical environment. That's culture shock. So today's discussion board number 9 is for you to define what it is to experience culture shock. Google it, look it up, find out some information about culture shock, reverse culture shock, and share with your classmates the information you find on what is culture shock, how is it defined, how do people in their head cognitively get their minds around dealing with culture shock, and then comment on what a colleague is thinking and posting. Now, we are all over the place in terms of the types of personalities we are. Remember at the beginning of the semester, we did the Myers-Briggs personality test. I'm an INTJ. That means I tend to be introverted and I tend to be intuitive in thinking and judging. I like lists. I like order. I tend to get things kind of from my gut and intuit it. I tend to judge things, right? It's how I take in information, look at it in the world. We've got folks that are all different kind of Myers-Briggs personality tests. Now, yeah, there's some differences in those personalities, and we can have some fantastic discussions about whether Myers-Briggs is a perfect method or the right method or a 100% accurate method. It's not 100% accurate. It's not the perfect method, but that's not pertinent to what I'm talking about. The fact is, we experience and respond to things in different ways. There are going to be lots of different ways of coping with, dealing with, getting in our minds and cognitively understanding what is culture shock, how are we experiencing it, what things are we seeing that are culture shock. So I would ask you to stick with me, show grace to each other in explaining this, put your discussion board exercise, come at it from wherever you're at. What is culture shock? How do people define it, discuss it, talk about it, Google, read, look at Wikipedia, look a little bit, get your mind around what is culture shock, and then staying in your head space, right? The what do you think about, not the what you do with your hands, not the what you feel with your heart, but what do you think in your head? Tell us how you're experiencing culture shock and comment on how somebody else has expressed how they're experiencing culture shock. Discussion board number 9. What is culture shock and how are you experiencing it right now? Thanks.